Well, good evening to you all. My name is David Held. I'm the head of University College, but particularly with Mark Shaw standing over there, we run together the Durham Castle Lecture Series, of which this lecture is the first and very distinguished lecture of the year. Let me say what a pleasure it is to see so many people here this evening. We run a fantastic series of diverse lectures, and I very much hope that you will come not just to, of course you're here tonight, but to come to other occasions. We film all the lectures, they're all online as well. It is a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce Hugh Pennington. The world, as we all know, faces a number of existential challenges. The spread of nuclear weapons, the threats that emerge with climate change. But in recent years, anxiety has also grown, and the alarm bells have rang in connection with the threats, new perceived threats from bacteria and AMR, antimicrobial resistance. These issues are everywhere, in the newspapers, widely discussed, but there is no authority, probably in the world, greater than the one we have this evening, Professor Hugh Pennington, whom I'm delighted to introduce to you. Hugh has a highly distinguished career, understatement, in academic and in public life, and is, in short, a world-renowned scientist. He's Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at the University of Aberdeen. He has worked over many years in public and private life, as I said, but for the UK, Scottish and Welsh governments as an expert in microbiology and food safety, and was a founding member of the World Food Programme Technical Advisory Group, a very important body. Among his many, many, many publications, I'm only going to mention one tonight that's particularly relevant to this lecture, a recently published book, Have Bacteria Won? Well, I look forward to the answer to this question this evening. Please join me in giving our speaker a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I hope I don't disappoint. It's a very important question. Have bacteria won? Well, if they'd won, I'd be out of a job. To be cynical, bacteria have been good for my career, but let's press on. Let's go back to, say, the 1840s or 1850s, and this is a gentleman, this is a picture out of a surgical textbook showing an amputation of somebody's arm, and the amputation is being done because the arm is infected with bacteria. You can see the bloody bandages down the arm. Whether this was an anesthetized patient or not, well, it's hard to tell. He might have had a bit of chloroform, on a rag over his face. But anyway, you had about a 20% chance of dying from the operation. And surgeons just put up with that, and the patients had no choice. Let's go back to Aberdeen. I've worked there for a long time, and I'll use some of the events there as an example of basically why bacteria haven't won, or rather why they shouldn't have won. This is a photograph that's entitled An Operation in Aberdeen in 1880. I can assure you that we no longer have carpets on the floor of our operating theatres, and our surgeons don't wear frock coats. But this was a very important event in the struggle against bacteria, let's put it like that, in the war against bacteria, because this was a great success. This is illustrating Joseph Lister's carbolic system, antisepsis. You can see the student on the right has got the famous spray, which sprayed carbolic everywhere. And a student in the middle has got a pan full of carbolic in which hands were dipped. And I'll come back to the hands. The hands are really important in terms of whether we're succeeding or losing the fight against bacteria. Now, this was a stage photograph, it's quite obvious. This is the same, not quite the same group of students, but the same surgeons. These were propaganda pictures taken by a photographer in Aberdeen showing how you did antiseptic surgery. And I think, as far as I know, they're the only ones in existence of somebody actually having a photograph taken, or two photographs taken, during the procedure. Just to illustrate how important it was then, it was very important. It reduced the wound infection rate after surgery caused by bacteria, of course, very, very substantially. There were side effects to it as well, that after you dipped your hands in the carbolic, they got rather sore. They were very good from the point of view of not infecting the patient. And after you'd done it for a while, you took a holiday. Surgeons used to take a holiday because the carbolic goes through the skin and affects the kidneys. So when you started passing black urine, you know it was time to take a break from your surgical work. Just go back one slide. The gentleman with the moustache in the middle was our professor of surgery, Alexander Ogston. And he discovered Staphylococcus aureus, which is a bug that most people have heard of, maybe as MRSA. MRSA stands for, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And the name was coined by the professor of Greek at Aberdeen University. And basically it means these round things that are yellow on culture on a plate. Alexander Fleming was working on Staph aureus when he discovered penicillin. And this is a photograph, well, this is a Time magazine, it's nice to be on the front of Time magazine. My career owes something to Alexander Fleming because the person who gave me my first job in microbiology had worked for Alexander Fleming. It just shows how old I am. He was a Durham Scot and discovered penicillin by accident. This is the famous plate that you should see the mold at the bottom. You can see that the colonies of Staphylococcus close to the mold are very small. As they get further away, the penicillin concentration in the agar gets less, and so the staphs grow and are quite happy. The story about how this was discovered is completely wrong. If anybody has been down Praed Street at St Mary's Hospital, there's a plaque on the wall saying penicillin discovered here, and the spore of the mold is supposed to have come through the window. It didn't come through the window because the window was always closed. Fleming kept his cultures that he was going to use for student demonstrations on the windowsill, and some of them were very nasty bugs like anthrax, and if they'd fallen out onto the passers-by, there would have been a bit of a difficulty. And the plate was never incubated. He forgot to put the plate in the incubator when he went on holiday. It's a very complicated story, but and somebody downstairs was working on penicillium molds for another purpose, and the spores came up the stairs. So the story's wrong, but of course the outcome is a very good one. And this is the timeline. So Staphylococcus aureus, discovered in Aberdeen, 1880. Penicillin resistance was first demonstrated in 1942, really by Alexander Fleming himself, not in patients, but in the lab. And in his Nobel lecture, which is well worth reading, 1945, he talks about antibiotic resistance as a problem that will come. And he was, he's predicting it, and he was right. MRSA, as I said, stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, first discovered in 1963, and the way bacteria work is still full of mysteries. This particular MRSA came and then it went, and we thought, not a big problem. And it came back again, 1992, a particularly nasty one, the one that we've all heard about, epidemic MRSA came back and spread through the UK and worldwide and so on. In fact, it's evolved on more than one occasion. Okay, let's go back to penicillin. And basically, this is an ad for American building workers putting up factories to make penicillin. And of course, the message here is that the sooner you get the penicillin being made, the better it will be for our soldiers. Well, it's not quite as simple as that. The penicillin wasn't used to treat wound infections in soldiers. There was, in fact, another disease that the soldiers got down in the back streets of Cairo or somewhere it was. They got gonorrhea. And there was a debate among the military. Should we give the penicillin primarily to the soldiers with gonorrhea, or should we give it to the soldiers who had wound infections? And this went right to the top. And Churchill was asked what his views were, and he said, whichever is the greater military advantage should determine what it's used for. And the greater military advantage was to treat the soldiers with gonorrhea, because they were going to be out of the front line for 2 weeks in the old system with one shot of penicillin. They were cured and they could go back fighting. And so that was where penicillin was first used very successfully for a while, until the penicillin resistance developed in the gonorrhea. We don't use it anymore for treating gonorrhea. Okay, so that's a bit of history there. Well, I suppose you could say this is a bit of history. This is 1996, and this is where I got into the sort of public demonstration of microbiology, or reacting to microbiological events on the public stage. This is a church hall in Wishaw, a town near Glasgow. This is a police photograph, which was taken because there was an inquiry after what had happened there. And you can see it's just about Christmas time. Santa is on the wall. You can just see some Santas on the left-hand wall there. Well, why a church hall in Wishaw? Well, there was a meal. The minister at the church decided for the frail elderly who couldn't come to church very often, he would persuade them to come for a free meal. And unfortunately for some of them, it was the Last Supper. The black dots on this particular meal, the black dots show where the people who were infected with E. coli 157 had sat and eventually died. So 8 of the people who had that particular meal had a fatal infection. Now, the moral here is, well, don't go to a church hall in Wishaw, but, and if you do, don't have the steak pie. Normally, we don't have a seating plan for a free lunch. And the seating plan was prepared because there was a rumour that the minister had some sort of effect, and if you sat next to the minister or near the minister, your chance of dying was higher. Now, the minister sat halfway down the table on the right, and there was no truth in that rumour at all. It was purely random whether you perished or not. E. coli 157 can be prevented by a process which some of you will be familiar with, many perhaps not, called HACCP. This stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, and it's basically a way of making food safe. Well, the people at the church hall in Wishaw, the volunteers, were doing their best, but, well, they failed on some of the critical control points. I won't go into the details, very rather controversial, in fact. HACCP is the only, as far as I'm concerned, benefit from space travel, because HACCP was invented or developed by NASA and the US Army and a food company called Pillsbury to make basically space travel safe. You can imagine the consequences if an astronaut got diarrhea in space with zero gravity. It just couldn't be contemplated. And this was the driving force behind the development of HACCP. And HACCP is now the worldwide system for making food safe. And in fact, I was going to talk about Brexit, but I will talk about Brexit later, but it's even relevant in Brexit. Okay, so I was asked to do an inquiry into the Wishaw outbreak, and we published our report in 1997. I was asked to do it by the Secretary of State for Scotland, not so much as to work out what had happened, because in Scotland we have a public inquiry after a serious event like that called a fatal accident inquiry, which looked at the details of what had gone wrong and why the poor people who died. In fact, 21 people actually died. Not all the people were in the church hall, but the majority of the elderly were. Everybody was over 70, and that's a relevant fact. So I did this inquiry, we published the results, it went through Parliament, and it was accepted that in England, every butcher, because it was a butcher who was to blame for the outbreak, that the meat was contaminated, every butcher in England had to have a HACCP. In other words, they had to have a food safety plan in which the staff had taken part in its compilation, and it had to be tested to make sure it was right. An essential feature of HACCP is that you have to basically demonstrate that you're providing safe food by having a written record. Well, at the time of this outbreak, we were still moving towards HACCP in the sense that Europe had said we had to have one, the EU said we had to have one, and we'd said, it's a bit early, it's difficult, you know, butchers are not terribly good at the sort of technical stuff and all that. My report said, well, time now to have a proper, full HACCP where you had to write everything down. In Scotland, we did differently. We said, well, butchers were a special case, and we had to give them guidance more than just ask them to do it themselves. We had to give them guidance. So there was a divergence between Scotland and England. The divergence has disappeared, but it's an interesting political thing to think about, that we have different food safety rules north and south of the border. Anyway, 2005, another big E. coli 157 outbreak, this time affecting schools, and each red triangle on this map in South Wales are schools mostly in the valleys, and each one of those schools had at least one case of E. coli 157, and some had many more than that. And the Welsh Government was upset about this, naturally, because it was due to the school meals. You don't expect to send your child to school and to get them poisoned by the school meals. It doesn't happen very often. It shouldn't happen at all, of course. And this is a slide just showing the sort of event that, or exemplifying the event that led to the Welsh Government saying, let us have a public inquiry. A little boy who just started school died as a consequence of the E. coli 157 infection he contracted from the school meals. And he didn't die in an easy sort of way either. And this little boy is one who survived an E. coli 157 infection, but was left with severe brain damage. It was a case I was involved in, and he'd been on a farm visit and had picked up the E. coli on the farm visit. And eventually, the insurers of the farm had to pay £2.5 million compensation because the boy's house had to be modified and so on. So Tom Dowling was a sad case, but he survived for a few years. Mason Jones, who was a little boy who died in Wales, he started off with one of the common complications of E. coli 157 infection in young children, which is to get renal failure. And so he was taken to a top quality hospital to have his renal failure treated. He had to have peritoneal dialysis, where they stick a tube into your stomach basically and put saline in and then take it out, which acts as a slightly less sophisticated than dialysis on a machine. And then he started having fits because the toxin that the organism produces affected his brain. And that was treated with drugs. And after about 3 weeks, he died of a heart attack because the toxin can also affect the heart muscles. So it was very embarrassing for me because we'd had an outbreak in Scotland, and we thought we'd sorted out how to prevent these things happening again. And the similarities don't end there. This is a refrigerated van with the meat from the butcher in Wishaw who'd infected and killed so many people. And the samples were brought up to my lab in Aberdeen. My lab is in the ground floor of that building behind. It had a police escort. It was a forensically transported sample well, it wasn't a sample, it was a whole van full of meat. And the policeman who accompanied the driver, he said he felt a bit queasy after sitting for 120 miles in this van containing all this contaminated meat. And we found it. It was no problem. The guy in the lab who did the first test, he came rushing out. He's never seen so much E. coli 157 on a piece of meat. Now, this is the refrigerated van that was used in the South Wales outbreak 9 years later. Same scale, another butcher misbehaving. Mr. Barr, the butcher in Wishaw, he was fined £2,500. because the consequence of the outbreak being associated with his meat meant that his business disappeared. And it was quite a big business. He employed about 50 people. And that was considered to be part of his punishment. It wasn't punishment that was given to him. It was something that basically affected him. Mr. Tudor, the butcher in Wales, he went to prison because he'd been faking his records for his HACCP plan. He'd been saying that he'd been doing this sort of temperature control and so on. And when we looked at it in detail, it flouted the laws of physics. He said he was changing the temperatures in products faster than you could possibly do it. Anyway, he went to prison. After he went to prison, my public inquiry started. The Welsh Government asked me to do a public inquiry into what had gone wrong. On the front of the cover of the report that we eventually published, I put an electron micrograph of the organism that caused the outbreak in Wishaw. It's the E. coli 157. I thought that was a sort of nice touch, to link the two together. The big difference between a public inquiry and the inquiry I did for the Scottish Government was the price. Well, the first one wasn't as successful as I would like it to have been. HACCP was the thing that we said after the Welsh inquiry had to be done properly, blah, 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 as it had been after the Scottish outbreak. The challenge, I'll come back to public inquiries in a minute, the challenge is this kind of beast here, that basically if you take that animal to the slaughterhouse and slaughter it in that condition with all the shit hanging off it, I don't mince my words, you will get some of that onto your meat or onto the meat that the slaughterhouse is preparing. It's a microbiologist's dream or nightmare, whichever you like to think. You cannot deliver meat that's not going to be contaminated with the muck off that hide. And that was one of the recommendations in my Scottish inquiry. So it's a challenge because an animal like that is maybe carrying E. coli 157 in its bowels, but it doesn't affect the health of the animal at all. This is a peculiar pathogen that's only harmful to people and not to animals. The farmer doesn't know he's got it. There's no reason why he should because, well, even if he did know, there's nothing he can do about it. And the animal, the carriage in the animals comes and goes. So that's a big challenge that basically maybe 40% of the animals in the fields, ruminant animals, cattle and sheep, are carrying this organism, and so we have to protect ourselves against being infected with it, and it's not quite as easy, obviously, as it might seem. Public inquiries, to go back to it, the trouble with a public inquiry, and it's quite topical, I suppose, with other events that have been going on, is that once the inquiry finishes, you publish a report, and that's the end of it. The public inquiry then dissolves itself. It has no legal standing. When I was chairing the Welsh inquiry, I had the power to send someone to prison, sort of. I would have to do it through another channel if they didn't cooperate with the inquiry. But having written the report and submitted it to the Welsh First Minister, that was it. It relied on other people to read the report and act on it and so on. And it's been the same, for example, in other public inquiries. This is the number of inquiries that have been in football disasters. And you can see they go right back to the 1923, the first cup final. There was an inquiry. And Hillsborough is obviously still reasonably memorable. And all these disasters, and some of them were big, had inquiries, public inquiries, recommendations were made, but most of them didn't seem to, or the results didn't seem to live in the memory of those involved for very long. So that's just there as a kind of reminder that when you shout for a public inquiry, good might come from it, but it doesn't follow absolutely and essentially. I'll go back to hands. This is just a story just to show the issue about why the bacteria haven't gone away. This is a sports ground north of Aberdeen, a place called New Deer, after a Boy Scout camp during the millennium. And many of the things associated with our Millennium celebrations didn't go quite according to plan, and this one didn't either. The camp was held, and it poured with rain. And so the Boy Scouts were a bit bored because the sporting facilities that provided were no longer usable. And being slightly, inventive and so on, they decided to play snowballs with those objects on the path. And these are sheep turds. And basically that flock of sheep was a win-win for everybody because the sports ground wanted the grass cutting short, so they got a flock of sheep in, and the shepherd wanted to have his sheep fed, so he got that for nothing. But unbeknownst to everybody, that was a flock that was really carrying E. coli 157 in high numbers, in very high numbers indeed. So those turds were loaded with E. coli 157. The moral of this story is that the boys who had done their hygiene badge, compared to the boys who hadn't yet gone to their hygiene training, there was a 9-fold difference in whether they got E. coli 157 or not. Because the boys who'd had the hygiene badge, they washed their hands. They put them under a standpipe. It was a camp. It wasn't, they weren't sort of ensuite facilities. And this, to me, is the best demonstration ever, anywhere, of the effectiveness of washing the hands. It wasn't done with antibacterial soap. It was just done in a fairly straightforward, mechanical way. And it gave nearly a 10-fold protection, which is statistically significant. Let's put it like that. Most of the boys were slightly older than Tom Dowling or Mason Jones, so they didn't get the renal complications of E. coli 157. They just got bloody diarrhea instead, which is not very pleasant. So back to hand washing again. You'll all be familiar with Semmelweis, at least I hope you've all heard of Semmelweis. So this is the notice he put up in the university in Pest, where students who'd been to the post-mortem room before they attended and helped deliver women would have to wash their hands, basically in a kind of chlorinated, superchlorine wash. It was put out in Hungarian and in German because this was all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. And you can see the name at the bottom. And of course, the Hungarian way of describing yourself is you give your surname first, and then your first name comes second. So it just says, notice Pesti, that's university, that's Pest, and Egetemi is university, and so on. This was quite successful for a while. And Semmelweis is now a national hero in Hungary, and he's well known everywhere. He came to a sticky end in the sense that he went mad and was put into a lunatic asylum and died. But his memory lived on for a little while. And this is the problem with public inquiries. It's a problem with anything that happens when there's a disaster. Everybody says lessons must be learnt. Well, the lessons are always learnt, and then they're quickly forgotten. Okay. Just on a sidetrack here, this shows that the bacteria have not gone away. They can still win, and this was the famous Cadbury's chocolate outbreak with Salmonella. I think everybody here will have heard of Salmonella. It used to be much commoner than it was. I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the funny things about Salmonella food poisoning is that you have to eat a large number of Salmonellas to fall ill. E. coli 157, you can eat perhaps 10 bacteria and be infected and fall ill. It's difficult to measure the infectious dose because you can't use volunteers, obviously. So all you can do is go to an outbreak and find out, if you can, how many bacteria there, but around about 10. So for all practical purposes, that's one. One bacterium can kill you. Salmonella, it's nearer 1 million. At least it was thought to be nearer 1 million. This was based on volunteer studies done in American prisons, where prisoners were fed salmonella-contaminated food in various doses, and then their illnesses or otherwise was noted. And they had to eat a hell of a lot of salmonellas before they fell ill. I think they got mitigation of their sentences as a consequence. I don't think they had to fall ill before they got remission, but we couldn't do that kind of study nowadays for obvious ethical reasons. But anyway, the textbooks say 1 million salmonella is the minimal infectious dose. So when salmonella was found in some of Cadbury's chocolate, it wasn't actually in the chocolate they were testing, it was the crumb, the material they used to make the chocolate. Small numbers, they thought, well, there's too small amount here to infect anybody. Well, it turns out that it depends where you put the salmonella in terms of how infectious the organism is for you. And if it's in chocolate, the chocolate reduces the, it protects the salmonella as it goes through the stomach. The sort of coconut butter or whatever it is in the chocolate coats the bacteria and they whiz through the stomach. So you only need to eat 100 salmonellas rather than 1 million in order to fall ill. So Cadbury's made a mistake here by allowing this contaminated chocolate to go on the market. As you can see from this slide, they paid a heavy price. They had to recall the chocolate. They were fined large sums of money. Didn't do the reputation any good. For me, the saddest thing about this is not so much that they decided to sell it, but this happens about once a year with chocolate. Chocolate outbreaks of salmonella are well known, well described. The idea that you have to eat 1 million was well known. And for some reason, this information hadn't got through to Cadbury's. I want to go away a little bit from the topic of bacteria and just talk about food safety, because that's one of the areas that is of great interest to me, and talk about crooks, because you don't just fall ill with food poisoning because there are bacteria in the food. Sometimes you fall ill with food poisoning because somebody is deliberately running risks. They're not necessarily bacterial risks. You can see here, this is about horse meat, and you may remember the horse meat scandal, that people were selling meat as beef or lamb or whatever it was, but actually it was horse meat. In some countries, horse meat is considered to be okay. This is what was happening in Paris, and this was in Charles Dickens' Household Words. In 1856. There's nothing new about horse meat scandals, absolutely nothing new at all. Closer to home, there's an island in Shetland which has the highest concentration of millionaires in the world. There aren't many people living there, but about half of them are millionaires, and they're millionaires because of fishing. And this is a typical, very large, you can see the red boat there, it's a very large fishing boat that goes out into the North Atlantic and catches fish. Not a bacterial story, but another story of crockery, which I thought perhaps might interest you. This was the 47.5 million black fish scam. These guys were catching fish they weren't supposed to be catching. They were pelagic skippers. And from this island, Simbista, which is the highest concentration of millionaires in the world, in the UK. And it was so deliberate, it wasn't they were just catching the fish, which they shouldn't have been. The fish processors, where they landed the fish in Shetland, they had two lines. They had the legal line and the illegal line. And when the inspectors were coming, some would rush out into the car park, go to the Wendy house and pull a lever so the fish would go down the official line and the weighing scales and all the rest of it. So the inspectors would say, oh, this is fine, this is good. As soon as the inspectors had gone, they only came once a year, somebody would rush out to the Wendy house and pull the other, so it went down illegal line. And these guys were only caught because they were declaring their income correctly to the Inland Revenue, and their income was far, far, far greater than the amount of fish they said they were catching. And the forensic accountants got to work and worked out that these guys were basically engaged in illegal activities, and so was the fish processor as well. So they didn't go to prison. They were just fined £100,000 or £1 million or something, and still made a vast profit. Food fraud is much commoner than people realise, and it doesn't just cause E. coli outbreaks, but all sorts of other problems as well. Back to Aberdeen. This is 1964. Her Majesty is visiting Aberdeen. I call this picture women wearing gloves. You can see the nurse on the left has got her white gloves on, and Her Majesty always wears gloves anyway, you know, when she's in public and so on. And she was coming to give Aberdeen a clean bill of health, because it was basically the bacteria had won in Aberdeen on that occasion. I showed this slide last week. I was invited to a conference in Chile last week, and I had to ask the audience, was there anybody from Argentina? And there were some people from Argentina in the audience, because the Aberdeen typhoid outbreak, the famous outbreak, was caused by corned beef imported from Argentina. And basically, 500 people got infected with typhoid in Aberdeen over a summer period. And of course, people say, well, you know, it just shows how mean the Aberdonians are. You know, you only get 500 slices out of a can of corned beef in Aberdeen. Actually, most of the people who got infected were not infected by eating the corned beef. They were eating other foods that had been contaminated by using a knife that had been used to cut the corned beef. And so this was what we call cross-contamination. And only about 40 people actually had eaten the corned beef, mostly young ladies from the prosperous West End of Aberdeen, because at that time there was a slimming craze, and part of the slimming method was to eat corned beef. So they were the first victim. Well, the first victims were actually university students in the Hall of Residence, and they came from a posh part of Aberdeen as well. But this illustrates how complex food safety can be. At that time in Argentina, the can was contaminated because it was washed with river water after it had been cooked, so it should be safe. It was washed with river water, which should have been chlorinated, but wasn't chlorinated, and it was calculated there was something like 600,000 tons of human waste coming down this river every day from a very large town in Argentina where there would be several thousand typhoid carriers, so you can imagine. And as the can cooled, if it had a little hole, a pinhole in it, it drew in a little bit of the contaminated river water. The curious thing about it is that at that time, we had a resident vet in Argentina checking on all these plants that were making corned beef. And they knew that the water wasn't being chlorinated because the plant had broken, but did nothing. Because their role was not to deliver safe food, the vet's role was to make sure that the imported beef from Argentina didn't have foot and mouth disease on it. Because foot and mouth disease in Argentina is just, you know, it's just, the animal's got a common cold type of illness. In this country, as you know, I'm sure, foot and mouth is a national disaster. So the vets failed, basically. We had an inquiry. We had an inquiry into the Aberdeen typhoid outbreak, a very good inquiry, worked all this out, and talked about cross-contamination and what had happened in the butcher in Wishaw and what had happened in Mr. Tudor's butchery in South Wales. They'd got cross-contamination. They'd moved the organism from its source onto other foods. So just proves my point, I think, about we learn the lesson and then we forget it damn quick. However, it's not all bad news. Some of you, I think Edwina Curry was in the news again recently for some reason. As they call it, she was part of the major disaster. I won't go into the details, but anyway, Edwina fell or was got rid of as a minister, as a junior health minister, because she said, sadly, most of British poultry production is contaminated with Salmonella. And she was right. It was interpreted that most poultry was contaminated with Salmonella, which is not true. Salmonella enteritidis, S. enteritidis, specializes in living in the reproductive tract of chickens. It doesn't cause any illness in the animals at all, but it gets into the eggs because it's in the reproductive tract of the chicken. And there was a pandemic, a worldwide outbreak of Salmonella enteritidis, which peaked in 1997. And you can see we had a large number of cases. This is human cases in England and Wales. And this is a gross underestimate, because not everybody who gets salmonella goes to see a doctor, and not everybody who gets salmonella who goes to see a doctor has a stool test. And it's only if you have a stool test that is then reported to the authorities that it comes into the official figures. So this is an underestimate by at least probably fivefold. We sorted it, enteritidis, almost, not quite, we've sorted it by two things. One is vaccinating the chickens against Salmonella enteritidis, because there is a vaccine which is quite good, and getting rid of rats in the hen houses, rats and mice, because it's easy enough to clear out the hen house. It's cleared out at the end of each process, but the rats and mice don't leave, and then they're carrying the organism, so they reinfect the hen houses. So rodent control and vaccination worked extremely well for Salmonella enteritidis. And it's been the same in other countries in the world. So that's a good news story. We're winning against the bacteria. We still have plenty of Salmonella about, not as much as some of the other bugs, but now for something completely different. This is a picture of my grandfather on the right. He was a chief male nurse in what in those days was called a lunatic asylum, a hospital with 3,000 patients. And I think being a male nurse in a psychiatric hospital was a better job than it would be these days. This was his house. This was his tied house, you know, a very nice house. And he was very well regarded, my grandfather. However, and my grandmother is to the right. And she started work as a nurse in that hospital towards the end of the 19th century, and she was in the infectious diseases hospital. They had a special infectious diseases hospital in that mental hospital. And they had terrible problems with dysentery, and this is a picture of the bowels of some poor patient actually at that hospital. A book was published about an outbreak they had of what they call asylum dysentery. And this is an organism called Shigella. Patients in these hospitals, and they still are, quite hard to induce to have good hygiene and all the rest of it. Many of the patients were demented, schizophrenic and so on, and it's very difficult to get them to wash their hands. Let's put it like that. We won't go into the details. And basically, Shigella is a very nasty organism because it can basically cause ulcers in your bowels and kill you quite speedily. And we used to have a lot of it in the UK. There are variants of Shigella. There are some which are nasty, others. We tended to have a milder variety. But the one thing that has led to the decline of Shigella, you only get Shigella now if you go on a package holiday to certain countries in the world. I mean, if you go to the Indian subcontinent, you're still quite likely to get Shigella. Not because your hygiene is bad, but you know somebody else's hygiene in the hotel is not so good. But the one factor, and this has been shown very clearly by studies in the Far East, is if you have proper toilet facilities in your house, not the outside bog, you know, the earth closet, but the inside and running water, the incidence of Shigella drops like a stone. It's as simple as that. You don't even have to tell people to wash their hands because they're going to do it because they have a tap now and have a water closet and all that kind of thing. And that's the simple explanation, and it's the best explanation of why this particular bug we're winning with Shigella. And this is applying to the third world as well as to the UK. There's some other diseases we've managed to get rid of. This is a paper on leprosy in Estonia. Leprosy used to be very common, relatively common, in all the Baltic countries. Finland had it, Estonia, northern Germany, the sort of mammal. And of course, it was famous. If you go to Bergen, I recommend anybody who goes on holiday to Norway, when you go to Bergen, go to the leprosy hospital, because that's where the organism was discovered. And that was still operating until the 1920s. Now, these are two people from Estonia who had leprosy round about the beginning of the 20th century. And it has now disappeared completely. And nobody's managed to come up with an explanation of why leprosy hung around in these Baltic countries and in Norway for so long. In Scotland, for example, there used to be lots of leprosy hospitals up until about the 15th century, and then they disappeared. Leprosy disappeared from Britain, many, many, many centuries ago. I have a theory as to why leprosy hung around in these countries. And of course, it's still relatively common in countries like India. It's treatable, so it's not a problem that it used to be. And it's to do with squirrels, because there are only two animals that leprosy will grow in apart from man. One is the nine-banded armadillo, which is relatively common in the US, where they still have local, Louisiana is the sort of epicenter of leprosy in the US, and they still have leprosarium there, and people catch it from their nine-banded armadillos, which used to be called Hoover's chickens, because during the Depression, people would catch their nine-banded armadillos in their garden and have it, for supper. Recently, it's been shown that red squirrels can also be infected with leprosy in the UK. And my hypothesis, which I've got absolutely no evidence for it, I'm just throwing it out as an idea, is that the people in these Baltic countries and Norway were quite big in the fur trade. And leprosy is quite a tough organism, and you can imagine handling skins and pelts from these animals. You might catch leprosy that way. Just a hypothesis, and if anyone wants to take that as a research project, I'd be very happy. Okay. So we've seen off leprosy. I don't think nobody in this country catches it. If you caught a red squirrel in this country, I think you'd probably be sent to prison, wouldn't you? The greys are all right, but the reds are so brilliant as a species that. And in Scotland, we have a great thing about red squirrels, and in fact, they're non-native, because we exterminated our red squirrels 100 years ago, and most of the red squirrels in Scotland are either English red squirrels or Scandinavian red squirrels. Anyway, that's by the point. You can still be killed by bacteria, although basically we don't die, generally speaking, from bacterial infections in our youth. We certainly don't die as babies as we used to. We do still die of bacterial infections at the end of our lives, and not basically pneumonia. The classical kind of pneumonia is still called the old man's friend. It carries you off quietly, at the end of your life, when you're going to die of something else anyway, sort of thing. But still, you can be attacked as a young person. Here you are. This is the Daily Sport. I don't know whether the Daily Sport still exists as a newspaper, semi-pornographic newspaper. They got this story going: bug that eats you alive, killer virus scoffs 3. Well, this wasn't a virus, it was a bacterium. And this is the infamous necrotizing fasciitis. And the bad news about necrotizing fasciitis is it was first described in China in the 1920s by an American surgeon who was working in Beijing. And the results of treatment nowadays are no better than the ones he had in the 1920s, which means basically cutting out the lesion, because antibiotics don't work, because the bug destroys the tissue so quickly, the bloodstream, blood can't get at the tissues that are infected, so you can give as much antibiotics as you like, and it's not going to get at the bug to kill it off, although they're sensitive to antibiotics. Here's another example of it. Thank God I'm fat. So this poor lady, she had an infection. it moves very rapidly. It really does move, not quite as a foot a minute or whatever it said in the Daily Sport, but it moves very rapidly and is an extremely unpleasant organism. And classically for infections, it's not something you catch from somebody else. You don't catch it by sitting on a toilet seat or anything like that. It's your own bacteria that get into your tissues and then take off. And it's very difficult to know why this happens. It just happens at random. So it could happen to anybody. It could happen to anybody. Anybody in this audience. Okay, so that's an example of a bacterium that it hasn't won, but it hasn't gone away. BSE and CJD are not caused by bacteria, but I'm taking a liberty here in saying, well, this was something that came out of the blue unexpectedly. It caused a lot of mayhem. It even got to the point where we were making jokes about it. This is out of a Christmas cracker. One cow to another, BSE, terrible, don't ask me, I'm a squirrel. Because the cows went mad. It's not called mad cow disease for no good reason. Now, this was in a Christmas cracker before people realized that it could cause a human infection. And just shows how difficult being a microbiologist is, or rather, how exciting being a microbiologist it is working out about the agent that causes CJD and causes BSE. There was a Nobel Prize given to Stanley Prusiner, who said it was a protein. I don't believe a word of it. It wasn't. Well, a protein is involved, but there are reasons, strong reasons to suspect that it's not just a protein. There's something else involved, probably an RNA molecule, a small RNA molecule, for reasons I won't go into. Still very controversial, but heat-resistant organism. We go back to Aberdeen. Scientists in Aberdeen worked out that if you feed cows meat and bone meal, which is basically ground up bones and a bit of rubbish old meat from dead cows, to other cows, it increases their milk production no end, because it's a source of calcium and nutrients and protein and all the rest of it. And if you cook it, you'll kill off the salmonella, for example. That's going to be a problem if you feed this basically cannibal diet to animals. What was not realized when this was introduced, about 10 years before the BSE started, was that the BSE agent could be there, very heat resistant. You can boil it forever and it's still infectious. And of course, BSE hadn't been described. It's a new disease in terms of British cattle. And probably what happened is that an animal came down spontaneously with this disease, went into the beaten bone meal, was ground up, was fed to other cattle, and we had an epidemic of BSE. We did all sorts of things to stop this being a threat to humans before it became evident that it was a threat to humans. We stopped the feeding of meat and bone meal. Before we knew there was a connection, we stopped the feeding of cattle brains to people, because that's where the agent would be if it was going to be anywhere. But none of that was enough to stop some people being infected, because they were all infected years before these measures were brought in. So there's a story there, which means that surprises will happen. Even when we do our best, and the scientific consensus was that BSE was not going to be infectious to people, it was going to be like Scrapey in sheep, which is a disease that's quite common in sheep in Britain, and we've been eating scraped lamb for hundreds of years without coming into any harm. So we can get it wrong, but nature is what it is. Okay. This is another new bug that appeared out of nowhere. This is the infamous E. coli 104H4. This is E. coli 0157, which is our British sort of, we specialise in E. coli 157 in the UK. I come from Aberdeen at the moment. Aberdeen is the place, the northeast of Scotland, has the highest instance of E. coli 157 infection in Scotland, and Scotland has 4 times as many cases per head of population as England, and the UK has higher instance of infection compared to anywhere else in the world. So I come from the world epicenter for E. coli 157. Still quite a rare disease. E. coli 104H4 is a nastier bug. Germany and France, 2011, we had 3,000 cases more, and 782 of them got HUS, which is the hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is this condition where you get the kidney damage and the brain damage that I described with the Tom Dowling case. And 46 people died. We solved the problem by doing sequencing of the organism. But this is how this happened. This was fenugreek seeds. I'm not a great fancier of salads and things, but anyway, and I don't touch fenugreek if I know about it, but still, 1,500 kilograms taken from Egypt to Antwerp, and they worked out the route of transport, and then it was taken to a German sprout producer. Sprouted seeds are potentially quite dangerous because if you have contamination, bacterial contamination on the outside of the seed, when you're sprouting the seeds, it's ideal conditions to grow the bacteria. And this is what happened here. The 104 grew on the sprouted fenugreek, and which was then used as a garnish on salads in restaurants, mostly in Hamburg and western part of Germany. And all these people fell ill by eating this. And of course, it was difficult to identify. The fenugreek wasn't on the menu. It was just sprinkled on a salad as a garnish. So if you asked somebody what they'd eaten, they didn't tell you that they'd eaten fenugreek because they didn't know they'd eaten fenugreek. They just had a salad. And only by looking at pictures and smartphones and that kind of stuff of people eating meals could you detect that there was fenugreek there all over the place. It's gone away, hasn't come back. It was a hybrid organism between E. coli 157 like E. coli and another E. coli that's quite common in Egypt that causes diarrhea. And these two organisms coming together led to this very, very, very nasty organism. And some came to the UK, and we re-exported it to France. And there was a party in France where they germinated their own fenugreek in jam jars and fell ill as a consequence of that. So, you know, bugs are versatile. They have no brains, but they're quite clever. Okay, this is from 1918, the famous influenza pandemic. And this is somebody, as you can see at the bottom, it says, this illustrates a pronounced degree of the heliotrope cyanosis. This patient is not in physical distress, but the prognosis is almost hopeless. This guy would be dead within 12 hours because his lungs would just fill up and he would essentially asphyxiate. And the biggest killer in 1918, well, there were two big killers. One was the flu itself, and the other was Staph aureus, back to our old friend Staphylococcus aureus. That if you got flu, what it does is it damages the linings of your lungs and opens them to Staph aureus, which is living in our noses. About 30% of you in this room tonight will be carrying Staph aureus up your nose. Maybe 35, maybe a bit less. Some of you will have it in your armpits. Some of you will have it on your backsides. But you know, it's a pretty common organism. Now, if you came back in 6 months' time, it wouldn't necessarily be the same 30% that would carry the organism. You know, it moves around and so on. And these poor unfortunates who had the flu in 1918, the ones who died, many of them, not all, but many of them died of a Staph aureus pneumonia. And if you get a Staph aureus pneumonia, that's very bad news indeed. Fortunately, it's quite rare, but it's very bad news indeed. Very difficult to treat. And of course, this was pre-antibiotic era. What did the authorities? Well, more American soldiers in the First World War died of flu than died from German bullets or shrapnel or whatever. And these are American soldiers being lined up to get their disinfectant sprays in their throats to stop them getting flu. Totally useless, probably harmful, but never mind. You have to be seen to be doing something to keep these bugs at bay. My boss, the first boss who got me into microbiology, who'd worked for Alexander Fleming, he made his career in the 1940s, early 40s, by developing a flu vaccine in Canada. He was working in Canada at the time, for the US Army, because they were worried in 1942 and 43 and 44, they would have the same problem they had in 1918. He developed the vaccine, but it was useless because by the time he developed it, it took about 2 years. The flu virus had moved on. Just like the E. coli, mutating all the time, swapping genes, and so on. That's why it's good being a microbiologist, you know. Nothing stays the same. It's changing all the time. Evolution is rolling on. And bugs evolve in real time, as many of you will be aware, that if you look at someone with HIV and you look at the virus in their bloodstream, they just don't have one strain of HIV. They have a whole family, a whole cluster of different HIV mutants, as it were. So this is World Health Organization, and probably the best thing they said about flu is, you know, the only thing certain about flu is that nothing is certain. And of course, this is very true as well, that, you know, making predictions is difficult, particularly about the future. And that, again, is why it's really good being a microbiologist, that, you know, trade is always going to be good. Trade is, doesn't mean to say that the bacteria have won. And these are the sort of reasons. You know, microbes evolve in real time. Most do. I don't think leprosy has evolved very much. It's got a rather feeble genome. And syphilis has evolved even less rapidly than that. The one microbe against which resistance has never been found is syphilis. It's as sensitive to penicillin now as when we started using penicillin in the 1940s. And that's a very good thing because it's now history. But the hospital where my grandfather worked, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were basically 3 causes of death. And in order of importance, the first was tuberculosis. And this is where my grandmother worked. She worked in the sort of, it was called the Infectious Diseases wing of the hospital, but it was basically for patients with TB. The second was syphilis, tertiary syphilis, which affects the brain and causes a condition called general paralysis of the insane, which is uniformly fatal. And the third was the dysentery. The dysentery came and went. And, you know, they did introduce, you know, sanitary things that could reduce the incidence of that. But syphilis has gone as an untreatable disease. It's always sensitive because the organism is so feeble in the sense of having it's a rather limited genome. It's totally specialized in doing what it does. It doesn't come from animals. It's entirely a human infection. And it doesn't have any of those genes which enable it to develop resistance, like, for example, Staph aureus has a whole multiplicity of genes which help it to become resistant. TB has gone away. I'm of the last generation of people that were infected with TB. Most of the medical students in my year, when we had our MAN2 test, were positive. We'd all been infected with TB, majority of us, but hardly any of us had fallen ill with TB. So people of my generation, we were all infected with it, but didn't get ill. The generation before, a lot of them would, my teachers in medical school, many of them had TB. The lucky ones had been sent to a sanatorium in Switzerland. Totally useless, but very nice to go there for a year, you know, whining and dining and you know, seeing the hills with snow on them and all that. The classical study on why TB has gone away was done in a German prisoner of war camp in Silesia, where there were half the prisoners were British and half were Russian. And they got the same diet and they had the same work experience. And the British, however, had Red Cross food parcels. The Russians had no food parcels. And the Russians died in really very large numbers of acute tuberculosis, basically tuberculous pneumonia. The Brits hardly ever did. It's a brilliant study done by somebody who was a prisoner in the camp. It was an officer camp. And it's the clearest demonstration I know of the difference between diet and health. If you have an adequate diet, particularly protein, you're going to be able to resist tuberculosis, whereas people like of the Bronte generation, you know, died like flies. I was infected. All I've got is a little calcified spot on my lung, where the TB bacilli are still residing, I'm sure, but you know, they're not going to do anything. Keep my fingers crossed. Regulation is difficult. Well, you can see that I've talked about fraud and all that kind of thing. I have a cartoon on my wall which I bought from the cartoonist, and it's two doctors, and he said, "I don't need to wash my hands. I'm a consultant," it says, and persuading doctors to wash their hands to do what they were doing in 1880 in Aberdeen and so on has really proved bloody difficult. It really is. It's a cultural thing. It's not necessarily providing the wash hand basins, although that's obviously essential. And it's the same with food safety. It's sexually transmitted diseases. We're moving into an area where gonorrhea, which was, Monty and all those people were involved in the 1940s, we're moving into an era where gonorrhea is going to be only treatable by pre-penicillin methods. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, bloody hell, having disinfectant douches and all this kind of stuff. It wasn't always very successful either. And that is one of the organisms that really is showing the way in terms of developing resistance. Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer, and I have spoken on various events about antibiotic resistance, and she has this view that modern surgery would become sort of redundant almost if we didn't have antibiotics. I slightly disagree, but the US Army in the First World War had a really very good result from amputations done on soldiers in the battlefield who'd had very severe leg injuries, for example, and their surgery results were very good, relatively speaking. No antibiotics then. Clearly, you can reduce infection rates very, very substantially by prophylactic antibiotics, but it's a very substantial reduction of an already low level. The people who are most at risk from antibiotic resistance are people who are having treatment for cancer, who are having immunosuppression, and the elderly, who clearly are, because their immune systems have decayed like mine, we're more at risk because the bugs that specialize in developing resistance are the ones that hang around in intensive care units and places like that, apart from the gonorrheas and so on, where human behavior is obviously an important thing to try and affect. So I haven't spent too much time on antibiotic resistance, except to say we've known about it ever since we started using antibiotics. And if we don't reduce the use of antibiotics, we're in big trouble. And we led the way in the UK in 1947, and now in Bevan, not the NHS, the penicillin bill made it illegal to sell penicillin over the counter, whereas in many countries in the world that's still possible. And that's why typhoid, the Aberdeen typhoid, which was sensitive to antibiotics. Nowadays, if you catch typhoid, it's because you've been to a country where antibiotics are unregulated in terms of their sale and use. Money will be short. Well, we all know that. And greed will be with us forever. Well, they're all fraudulent people. So, have bacteria one? No, but my business will continue to be good. Thank you very much.
Well, that was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Can I go back? Can I go just to where you left it, really, with the threat of resistance to antibiotics? Because that is, a very topical theme now. And I wonder, what I draw from your lecture is it's not a new theme. It's become a popular worry. But how worried should we be, and why? Is it just due to overuse of antibiotics by us as humans, but also in the food chain? And is antibiotic resistance reversible? So how serious is the threat, and is it reversible?
Well, it's a serious threat because antibiotics are incredibly useful, and they will cure many diseases that in the old days we just have to die from or suffer from. And clearly we know, for example, from bugs like tuberculosis, that if we use the right regimes, like giving 3 anti-tuberculous drugs simultaneously at the beginning of somebody's treatment, you will be successful, other things being equal. But unfortunately, in many parts of the world, that has not happened. And it's got to the point in some countries, like, for example, in South Africa, where tuberculosis is completely resistant to all the anti-tuberculous drugs. Fortunately, not very common. It's controllable by locking people up, which is what we used to do with some of these, well, like leprosy. We used to, the way to control leprosy was to lock up the lepers. And in some parts of the world, we still have to do that with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. But so that shows that if you don't use the regimes we know about, if you don't apply existing knowledge, you'll run into trouble. And the reasons why that happened, of course, there's more than one. For example, when the Soviet Union fell away, the public health system fell away, and it was sort of left to individual doctors to do their prescribing. And it's also up to individual patients as to whether they followed a regime and so on. So, human behavior comes into it, politics comes into it. It's not just about the money, because the anti-tuberculous drugs are not particularly expensive. So that's just an example of how complex the situation is, but it is a sort of controllable one. We have multi-drug resistant TB in the UK, and of course we thought TB was on the way out until HIV came along, which destroys people's immune systems and makes them much more susceptible to TB. So, there are all sorts of complexities about it. In the UK, the big problem is bugs in intensive care units, which are the happy home of the microbiologist and also of the drug-resistant bacteria as well. Because just imagine you're in there, you're coupled, you're semi-conscious, you've got pipes going into every orifice. It's very, very difficult to stop a bug getting in through those interventions and then hanging about in the ITU and becoming resistant because all those patients are on antibiotic regimes of this, that, and the other. Some not very successful. So that's a big area where you'll always find the microbiologist almost resident there because of the problems. In general practice, of course, people have blamed GPs for overprescribing. The people have blamed patients for asking for an antibiotic for a sore throat. Alexander Fleming talked about that in 1945. The sort of bugs that cause sore throats are not susceptible to antibiotics. So it's a very complex situation. It's a moving target. The initiatives at the moment from the UK government, I'm not sure about I don't know where Trump stands on antibiotic resistance. There's hope there. But anyway, I mean hope in the sense of having something happening to Trump. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But still, but so Barack Obama was very keen on having a program, not just to control the use of antibiotics, but also to develop new ones. My worry about the new ones as the solution to the problem is that, well, it's not a worry. I don't think it is a solution to the problem because methicillin came in, and the word at the time was this was not penicillin. It's completely different from penicillin. It's not affected by the enzyme that destroys penicillin, which makes bugs like Staph aureus resistant. So therefore, problem solved. Within about 18 months, methicillin-resistant staphylococci appeared using a completely different mechanism of resistance. And I fear the same would happen with new antibiotics, that after a while, we would develop resistance. Now, it's not inevitable. There are antibiotics. There are antibacterial drugs in use now, which have been in use for many, many years, which bugs can develop resistance to, but because the bugs are so enfeebled, don't go anywhere at all. There's one that's used for urinary tract infections, which is the commonest infection in the UK community, for example. Reversibility, the story would be that the bacteria have to spend a bit of energy in developing the resistance mechanisms and keeping them going. So therefore, when you take the antibiotics away, they should go back to their natural state. It doesn't seem to happen too well like that. Once they're resistant, they hang on with the resistant ones hang on there. I think that's the attitude to take.
Many thanks. Very, very illuminating. Questions? There's a mic. Just put your hand up if you want to ask a question, and a mic will come to you. Yes. 1 second. The mic's coming.
Fine, don't need a mic. Professor Garner of Warwick wrote to the Times in the last fortnight suggesting that there may not be a problem at all, Professor, that by combining various antibiotics, which he's starting to experiment with, the problem may just go away. Would you like to comment on that?
It'd be nice if he was right, wouldn't it? It'd be nice if he was right. Yes, treating an infection with more than one antibiotic, it's been around, we developed this in the UK many, many years ago for tuberculosis, for example, and it's widely used in other situations as well. I mean, cost does come into it with some of the antibiotics, which are quite expensive, but I can't see that as being a solution to the problem. I think it may well be it's a solution in some particular areas. The trouble is that many of the bugs that we're using antibiotics against are already resistant to lots of them naturally. E. coli, for example, is pretty resistant to many of the, penicillin doesn't touch it. And so the range of antibiotics that's available to you to treat some infections is really quite limited. You don't have that luxury of picking out of a whole sort of portfolio of different drugs. And I think that's where the benefits from new antibiotics might come in, if we can find new targets to attack. And one of the problems about developing new antibiotics is it's difficult because we've already found all the easy targets. We're now looking for more difficult targets. But if we found new targets which are not related to the old ones, that might be another way of applying that philosophy that, you'd use this one in combination with another one and reduce the risk of that particular bug becoming resistant. So, yeah, there's something in it, but I'm not putting my money on it as a solution. I think this is a problem which will be with us forever. It will come and go. New antibiotic resistance variants will appear. Old ones, like the early MRSAs, might disappear for reasons which we don't understand. And it's all basically, to be cynical, it's all good news for the microbiologists.
Anyone else? Further questions? We have some experts at the front. Anybody here? Yes, very good. Here, let me just give you this mic.
You said you were going to talk a little bit about Brexit and how that might influence microbiology.
Let's just move it away from the speaker.
Yes, it boils down to regulations about food safety and HACCP, which I described as coming out of the US. The implementation of HACCP in the UK was basically down to European directive. Well, when Brexit happens, we won't be having to do anything about European. Well, we will have to think about European directives as they might affect our trade, and so that's one of the items that's going to have to be in this giant bill, and Henry VIII and rules and all this kind of stuff, because we're going to have to face up to the fact, not just to protect public health, that HACCP is a good thing, which it is, but also that if we want to sell our food abroad, it will have to have been produced using sort of HACCP rules and all the rest of it. And I think that's one of the complications of Brexit that we've not discussed too much, that if we want to sell abroad, we'll still have to have the sort of European type of rules if we're going to sell ourselves as sound and good producers. I was on a committee for, as I mentioned, for the World Food Programme, which was basically a safety committee looking at foods that were donated to the world. By the way, the World Food Programme is by far the most effective part of the United Nations. It's streets ahead of all the other bits because it works under the radar. They lose about 5 people a week, perish, working for the World Food Programme, never get into the news at all. They feed the North Koreans, for example. Don't want to make too much noise about that, because otherwise there will be famine. Anyway, that committee was set up basically to test foods, well, not test them, but to make sure that the foods that were going into the World Food Programme were good foods and would be advantageous to the recipients. And one of the things we said was that HACCP had to be there. And I can tell you, I know this is being recorded, but I might tread on some toes here, but the worst offenders in terms of trying to get their rubbish surplus foods into the World Food Programme were from countries like the US. And it wasn't the US government doing it, it was US food companies. And if you said, well, has this been through a HACCP process? They say, what's that? Whereas countries like Malawi and countries in Central Africa were giving food to the World Food Programme, and they had brilliant HACCP programs. So the world's a strange place.
Any further reflections, questions? Yes, there's one over here. Thank you.
Can you just pass it down? Hi. Could financial incentives be used to encourage farmers and butchers to be better prepared and look after their supplies better?
Financial incentives.
Well, yes. The farming issue is a difficult one in the sense that, well, I suppose you could take their subsidies away, but, you know, farmers are a powerful political group. Can I answer the question in a slightly different way? This meeting I was at last week, there were people from supermarkets there. And there are two win-win situations for a supermarket in terms of delivering safe food. You don't need to apply financial incentives. What they understand is that basically they have a moral imperative to deliver safe food. You know, they say that in their mission statements, but the downside of being associated with a food poisoning outbreak is very large. And so there's a commercial incentive, you know, not directly financial, indirectly financial, for them to deliver safe food. And, you know, generally speaking, the supermarkets do take a lot of, have a lot of concern in not having their products associated with bad news. And that's probably as powerful an incentive as you want to seek to make sure that they're doing. And generally speaking, they do that quite well. And I was rung up by the head man of one of the biggest supermarkets in the UK. They just had a small E. coli outbreak in Scotland, associated with food purchase from their supermarket. And the next day there was going to be the annual meeting, general meeting of that supermarket. And this guy was, you know, not to put too fine a point, he was shit scared that this news would come out and the share price would collapse and maybe he'd lose his job. As it happened, they managed to demonstrate that it wasn't food that they had produced. It was food that they'd bought in good faith, blah, blah, blah. You know, although HACCP would oblige them to make sure that their suppliers are also doing the right thing. So there are strong incentives. They're not necessarily directly financial. The financial penalties for getting something wrong are, generally speaking, I suppose you might say, trivial.
Hi. My question is, how do current undergraduates studying science degrees at the moment get involved with the study of infectious disease and bacteriology, as a job in the future? That was all.
Yes, lots of opportunities for people to get into that. I mean, legion of opportunities to get into basically seeing off the bacteria, let's put it like that. Not necessarily just by being, I came into it as a medical microbiologist, but also had dealings with the veterinary side as well, just purely by chance, which has been useful to my career. So basically you've got to take the opportunities that arise, but let's face it, many of the advances that are happening now in this area are to do with gene sequencing. And before I came here, we were having a meal with some of my colleagues here in the university and discussing this. And this is a fantastically rapidly moving field. Not just doing the sequencing, you buy a machine that does it, but doing the analysis of the results. And so it's not just the microbiologist sitting at the bench, the wet bench. There's all the other intellectual things going on. Clearly, Crick and Watson, Watson was behind the original E. coli sequencing program many, many years ago, which cost vast millions to sequence one E. coli. And now you can do it in about 10 minutes, and it costs a few £100, or maybe it's coming down even less than that. Through technical advances completely remote from microbiology. And then there's the area of looking at the new antibiotics and all that kind of thing, which is quite fashionable. So it's a fashionable area to be in because there is a lot of public pressure and political pressure to do something about it. As I mentioned, US presidents, British prime ministers are behind this. I'd like to see them putting a bit more money into it, but that's just a personal gripe. But we do very good research in the UK on it, and internationally there's also lots of other things. And I mentioned things like the World Food Programme. You can get into that kind of area as well, which is connected with improving diet. And about a quarter of the world's population doesn't really have an adequate diet, which in itself will have a big impact on winning the war against the bacteria.
Anyone else with an urgent question? Okay, in that case, before I thank Hugh Pennington, let me just draw your attention to the next two lectures. On the 1st of November, next week, we have probably the leading academic experts on Euroscepticism and its impact on not just in the UK, but in Europe. And that will be followed a week later by the very famous Martin Wolf, chief economist of the Financial Times, on the sort of critical issue as the crisis of democratic capitalism. What's particularly interesting about Martin Wolf is that Martin Wolf wrote a book in 2004 called Why Globalization Works. In 2008, after the financial crisis, he was not so sure. So this is probably the world's most seasoned financial journalist reflecting on the critical financial issues of our time. So having just said that, Hugh, thank you for two things especially. I mean, one, for combining great stories with scientific analysis and scientific knowledge, and two, for particularly illuminating the moral panic today about the threat of bacteria and particularly antibiotic resistance. So I'm glad the answer is no. It's reassuring, but we all need to go home later, wash your hands, and don't be too optimistic. So many thanks for taking.